Thank you. And welcome St. James Place. And thank everybody for coming out here on a special evening. Thank you to St. James Place and to the Harrises for creating this amazing space. Thank you to let them hear it. Thanks to CTSB, they are recording this, and we'll be showing it later this week. So we're appreciative of that. And thanks to all the Eagle people that are here helping out to try to make this event as seamless and easygoing as possible. The Berkshire Eagle is bringing this event to you tonight, but we're donating all the net proceeds to our local journalism fund. We entered the world of philanthropy a few years ago because we needed another revenue stream in addition to the typical ones newspapers have, circulation and advertising, to help us grow and continue to bring you the news that you want to read, to do more things for the Berkshires. And the Local Journalism Fund is the vehicle we've been using, and this is the kickoff of the 2024 drive. You'll be hearing from me in the mail. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to bring the gentlemen out here. They're going to inform us, entertain us, and hopefully bring some sanity to our lives. They're going to speak for about 40 minutes or so. Then I'm going to come back on stage and begin to ask some questions. Now, I think you all got 3x5 cards when you came in, and pens to write questions. If you have questions, Eagle people will be circulating up and down the aisles. Just make it known. They're going to pass them forward. Kevin Moran, our executive editor, is here. He's going to curate them, and I'm going to ask a bunch of questions at the end, as many as time will allow. I can tell you that when it comes to choosing questions, penmanship counts. Now, we've got two incredible men here tonight that are going to speak. Peter Canellos is a Massachusetts journalist, as is Joe Klein initially. He grew up in Lowell. He went to the University of Pennsylvania and started the Boston Phoenix. He went to the Boston Globe, was the editorial page editor there. He's here for the Globe. And is now the managing editor for Enterprise at Politico. He's also written two really important biographies. One of Ted Kennedy, lying in the Senate, and the Great Dissenters, the story of the life of Justice John Marshall Harlan. Harlan was the only judge to dissent in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the case where the Supreme Court said, it's okay if the states want to legalize the separation of the races. It took another 60 years before the court got their head straight and undid that in Brown versus Board of Education. But Harlan was an interesting man, and Peter wrote a heck of a book about it. And of course, Joe Klein. Everybody knows Joe Klein, nationally respected columnist and writer. He too graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. We got a lot of Quakers here tonight. And Joe, even though Joe's from New York State, his first job was as a police reporter at the Beverly Times on the North Shore. Let's hear for Beverly. No. He's best known probably for writing columns from Time magazine. He's also written for the New York Times, the New Republic, the Washington Post, and Rolling Stone. Joe has a Berkshire connection in that he wrote a biography of Woody Guthrie, and he did that because he got to know Arlo. So he has a little bit of a Berkshire connection as well. He's also known for having written Primary Colors, a novel or a monoclef, depending who you talk to, that parallels the Clintons. It was made into a movie, a major motion picture, starring John Travolta and directed by Mike Nichols. He now publishes a newsletter called Sanity Clause, and I heartily recommend it to you. But I'm more interested, or more proud that Joe's here because he really is why we own the newspaper. It was 10 years ago, it could be 10 years ago to the day. Jude and I were in Nantucket. We went to an event just like this in a church. It was the Unitarian church there. and it was a benefit for the local library, the Nantucket Athenaeum. And Joe was giving a lecture, and in the middle of his lecture, he said, what sounded almost offhandedly, democracy requires citizenship, and citizenship requires a town square. I whispered to Judith, the Berkshire Eagle. I mean, I was facing mandatory retirement. I had no idea about this. And I was so full of myself, we went out to dinner, and I said, I know exactly how to do it. I have a plan. And I can assure you that plan would have fallen flat on its face. But fortunately for us all, a few months later, I met Hans Morris, and that led us to Bob Wilmers, and that led us to Stan Lipsy, and as they say, the rest is history. So in many respects, we all owe tonight to Joe Klein. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Peter Canellos and Joe Klein.
All right, thank you, Fred, and it's an honor to be here as a part-time resident of Berkshire County and someone who really understands, as I'm sure all of you in the audience do, what a special thing Fred has done, and Kevin Moran and Hans Morris and other people at the Eagle have done in really restoring and treasuring a journalistic icon.
Yes.
And Joe, of course, it's a great honor to be here with one of the great political journalists, somebody who was an idol of mine as a younger journalist, and person I've admired throughout my entire career. So it's great to be here with you.
And likewise, it's an honor for me.
Thank you. Well, let's start off with a reference to something that Fred had said. I mean, you have spoken very eloquently about the role of the media as a convening force, as a stabilizing force in communities. Your own first job was at the Beverly Times. Tell us a little about why society needs exactly that kind of connection.
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my high school English teacher, if there are any English teachers out there. But I also wouldn't be here if I hadn't started at the very bottom rung. A car driven by so-and-so collided with, you couldn't say hit, because that would convey fault. Collide with a car driven by such and such at the corner of such and such and such and such. I went from there to being the editor, to being the political writer and city council reporter for the Peabody Times, which was fortuitous because Walter Winchell once said, if you really want to learn about politics, go to Peabody, Massachusetts, which I did. And I went from there to the Underground Press in Boston, and but also during that time, how many Bostonians we got around here? Hands? Yeah, only a few. It's mostly New Yorkers. Huh? But there was a show on WGBH called The Reporters back in the early 70s, and I was one of the 5 reporters, and we would go out into the neighborhoods, and we would report. We would report on sanitation problems. We would report about police stuff. We would report, I did a lot of time in East Boston when Logan Airport was trying and succeeding in expanding. And the act of actually reporting led me, became the habit of my life. And the first big story that I ever covered was busing in Boston. I covered it for WGBH, and then I covered it for the real paper. What happened was I was, the staff of the Cambridge Phoenix went on strike. The owner sold it to Boston After Dark, which then became the Boston Phoenix. The staff said, you can sell the name, but you can't sell us. We're still the real paper. And they elected an editor and elected a publisher, and assistants voted on their bosses' salaries. And I said, I got to be part of this. But I went out and covered busing in the streets, and I covered both sides of it. I covered it in the black neighborhoods, and I covered it in the white neighborhoods. And I found that I couldn't find a single black parent who was in favor of it. The Boston Globe, sorry, Peter, was touting it as the greatest thing since sliced bread, but nobody wanted it. And that set me on my course for the next 50 years. I realized that you couldn't have opinions. A lot of people do have opinions without actually reporting them through. But I couldn't have opinions without reporting them through, which is why 40 years later, in my mid-60s, I found myself, on patrol outside the wire in Afghanistan and Iraq, because I had to go there to see what was happening. And I think that when we talk about journalism, and when we talk about where it starts, which is places like the Berkshire Eagle and the Beverly Times, it's necessary that there are observers. It's necessary that you got someone covering the city council and the zoning board of appeals. I will tell you a quick story. First election I ever covered was for the zoning board of appeals in Peabody, Massachusetts. And part of the job of the zoning board of appeals was canine control. They hired the dog catcher. And one of the candidates actually said, "This is a crossroads in the history of canine control in Peabody, Massachusetts." And every single election, and I have covered hundreds and hundreds of them since, someone has said this is a crossroads in the history of something or other. And I would, I had a lot of fun with that. I would get up and before audiences like you and say, "This is America. We're not at the crossroads of anything. We're the most successful country in the history of the world. We got problems, but we're not at the crossroads until this year. Now we are actually at a major crossroads, and we're going to decide what kind of country we are." Long answer, sorry.
To connect with the sort of journalism theme, a lot of those same papers like the Eagle, like the Beverly Times, and many, many other great regional and local newspapers in New England were also the source for communities of trusted national news. The news may have come from the New York Times news service or the Washington Post, LA Times news service, the Associated Press or something like that, but it was validated by local editors like Kevin and his team, who choose to highlight these stories. So for millions and millions of people around the country in these trusted local outlets, they would get a carefully vetted view of the world, including, in national terms, political coverage. And we all know that era when you were the dominant political writer and columnist at Time magazine, and probably one of 5 or 6 people who really played a central role in vetting candidates. Time was unusual in that it actually had a national distribution. It was pretty much that and Newsweek were pretty much the only 2 outlets that did. Now, obviously, political communication is very different. That media filter doesn't exist nearly to that extent. In all of these communities that have news deserts and lack local news, people only get news through social media. So tell us what the effect has been of losing that media filter at the national level.
I remember being really thrilled. I was being paid, I think, 10 cents an inch when I started as a freelancer. And seeing that on the op-ed page there was a column by David Broder of the Washington Post. I was in the same newspaper as David Broder. Later, David and I rode a lot of buses together. But, over the course of time, I'll answer that in a different way. The biggest change in journalism during my 50 years of trying to do it is that the basic default position when I started was skepticism. Politician would say something to you and you'd say, but wait a minute. Or actually my favorite question was, really? Tell me more. If you want to make a fool of yourself, go for it. Skepticism. And that slid over time into cynicism. And cynicism is the assumption that everybody is acting on their worst impulses. Now, I've known Donald Trump for 40 years, and I can assure you that he is acting on his worst impulses. But a lot of journalists took that easy way out, and cynicism became the rule of the day. And it became that way because of marketing. When I was a kid, we had 3 TV networks. We only had 3 flavors of ice cream, except for Hojo's. And now, and especially in the 90s, this shifted. When cable news came along, when we had 1,000 channels of cable, whatever, it became bread and circuses. It became the desperate search for an audience. You know, the papers that you talked about were a force for stability. Let me tell you guys, stability doesn't sell. Bread and circuses sells. And there has been a natural progression from that to the internet, to social media, where there are tens of thousands of outlets, most of which, many of which, are not reported and are not vetted, and thrive on controversy, which is why I started Sanity Clause, which came from the Marx Brothers at the night at the opera, and it was Chico's line, actually, where the Marx Brothers were cutting up, and the director of the opera said, "You can't be so crazy, it's in the contract." And he brings out this contract that goes on, and Chico's looking at it, and finally he says, "There ain't no sanity clause." So what I felt the need to do was to kind of to vet my colleagues my former colleagues in many ways, and also to use the experience I'd gotten over the years. The fact that I could never be entirely, CNN hired me at one point to be a commentator, and they hired me as a liberal, and I was speaking as you had to go head-to-head with someone, a conservative, and I was a lousy CNN commentator because I would agree with the conservative as often as I didn't, and sometimes I would it was what was her name, Tory Clark, and sometimes I was to the right of her on things. But the only reason why I took the positions I took was because I had reported them out. And so I can guarantee you, folks, that if there is something that I haven't reported out and comes from my mouth tonight, I will let you know.
Thinking back to those early days, and maybe even some of your mid-career days, could Donald Trump have emerged as a serious contender for president in the era when you were writing your column for Time magazine and David Broder was writing his column, and there was a coterie of trusted senior journalists who were playing a role vetting the candidates?
Well, I kind of saw it coming. 30 years ago, I guess I was at the New Yorker at that point. I've been around. I wrote that what we're about to see in this country is the revenge of the gringos. No great country in history has changed ethnically and maintained the same government. And I thought that that was going to be one of the greatest American challenges. And so I thought that there was going to be a white reaction 30 years ago, and Donald Trump brought it. Now, I got to, in all fairness, say that the Democrats had a very large helping hand in this. They decided that identity was more important than unity in the mid-90s. And while it was with the very best of intentions, programs like affirmative action might have had a rationale for a brief period of time, but making distinctions according to race was going to get us into a lot of trouble, and it has. And then on top of that, making distinctions according to gender, making distinctions according to who you choose to love, making distinctions according to whether you are an immigrant, whether you're Latino or Latina, and then making decisive and, I thought, preposterous changes to the language. My daughter-in-law is from the Dominican Republic, and you ask her what she feels about being called Latinx. This was arrogance. It was arrogance on the part of the academic left, and I got to tell you, I spent a lot of time out in J.D. Vance country, and even in realer J.D. Vance country, and don't think for a moment that those guys didn't notice it. And don't think for a moment that the polls that show that white people in this country feel that they are discriminated against come out of the ether. It comes out of 30 years of making distinctions according to race. And if it was viable at some point, I think it's no longer viable. I think we have to move past that. We can make distinctions according to economic status. We can have affirmative action for the poor of every color. But I think that Donald Trump is the unnatural spawn of liberal arrogance. Now, on top of that, he's one of the 3 worst human beings I've ever met. And I've met a few. I mean, I interviewed Bashar Assad, I interviewed Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I think, Assad was a little bit more truthful than Ahmadinejad, no. But this kind of thing was coming down the pike, Peter.
Now, if you could advise Kamala Harris on how to contend with this problem, Donald Trump being one of the problems, the other problem being the one that you sketched out, the deep distrust in the central part of the country and among white voters with the Democratic Party, how would you advise her to deal with that?
Well, I think she's doing pretty good so far. But I think that sooner or later, if she's going to make this a contest between the future and the past, as she's trying to do, and if Donald Trump and making distinctions according to race, by the way, Donald Trump practices the original identity politics that we can't forget, which was white supremacy. And we have hundreds of years of shamefulness to overcome. But we also have to be, I had this conversation with Hillary Clinton in 2016, not to drop a name or anything, but she would end her stump speech by saying, I'm in favor of civil rights. I'm in favor of LGBTQ rights. I don't know that there was a plus at that point, but that came along afterwards. I'm in favor of Latino rights. I'm in favor of women's rights. Now, there were 2 things that were problematic with that. The first was that her husband, when he ran for president, had the best political slogan I've ever encountered in the 11 presidential campaigns I covered on the ground, which was community, opportunity, responsibility. When was the last time you heard a politician talk about responsibility? What is your responsibility as a citizen? I mean, that's going back to the start of this conversation. You know, to be part of the public conversation, to be part of the public square, to be part of the forum that something like the Berkshire Eagle or the Beverly Times provides. Politicians don't like to talk about responsibility, but democracy doesn't come free. We have responsibilities, which is why part of my crusade over the last 40 years has been in favor of national service, especially the time I spent with the US military. So that was number one. But then number two was this. I pointed out to Mrs. Clinton, and we were talking off the record, and I really liked her a lot off the record. On the record, she got really stiff. But we were talking off the record, and I feel I can say it now. I said, look, the last 50 years have been the greatest period of human rights progress in the history of the species. About 50% of black families have incomes that are middle class or higher. The wealth gap remains huge, but that's mostly a function of home ownership. Gay rights, 2,000 years of unnecessary prejudice disappeared in the blink of an eye. Latinos are assimilating into this country very much the way Italians did 100 years ago, small business, muscle labor, that sort of thing, and essentially conservative. Women have superseded men in education and in many fields, and I think pretty soon the presidency of the United States. But and if not this time, next time. Do you realize that a greater percentage of black women graduate from four-year colleges than white men? We have had incredible progress in this country. Democrats refuse to talk about it, which is one of the reasons why they have very little credibility out in the rest of the country. I asked Hillary, why don't you go out to West Virginia or someplace like Kentucky or wherever and give a speech thanking the folks for being a part of these last 50 years of progress? And she said, that's an interesting idea.
You told me when we were talking earlier something that surprised me, that you felt right off the bat that Kamala Harris is a better candidate than Hillary Clinton, a better presidential candidate. You referred to the dangers of a Democratic candidate getting too sort of enmeshed in the party's constituencies, too far pushed to the left. Harris has the benefit, the really unique benefit of not having had to run in the primaries. Republicans obviously are identifying stances that she took in 2020, which was a very, very liberal year, and when she had her sort of aborted candidacy then. But she actually has a unique opportunity to define herself fresh today, right now, in one, speech that she's going to give in 2 weeks. What do you want her to say?
You've asked that before, and I evaded it the last time. Well, I've been saying what I'd like her to say. I mean, my feeling, I've never met Kamala Harris. I've known every president since Gerald Ford, but I've never met her. And my impression of her in 2020 was that she looked like she was trying to stand still while on roller skates. She was very shaky and discombobulated. And what happened in 2020 was that the Democratic Party mistook the left activism on social media for the public. And she took a whole bunch of positions that were really stupid. And she's walking back from them now, but that's the past. And I really want to hear about the future. And I'm really going to be interested. Last we looked, she hasn't chosen a vice president yet. But one of the things I'm interested in, 100 years ago, 1924, Democratic Convention in New York, which went to 103 ballots, was called the Klein bake because the greatest group of delegates were members of the Ku Klux Klan. The greatest group of delegates at every recent Democratic convention, including the one to come, are members of teachers' unions. I have tremendous respect for teachers. I think the good ones should be paid a lot more. I think the bad ones should be fired. I speak as a parent, and every parent in this room knows that every parent knows who the good teachers are and who the bad teachers are. I've also studied school choice for over 40 years, and starting in East Harlem. And I've studied charter schools. And in the Harlem Children's Zone, which is a group of charter schools in New York, the kids test as well as in affluent suburban high schools, public high schools in the suburbs. In New Orleans, every single school is a charter school. It hasn't been a silver bullet. There is only one silver bullet in education. But the woman who runs those schools said to me, we've had a major triumph here. We've turned a disaster into a mediocre school system. And I think that one of the things that she won't do, that I'd like to see her do, is to come out very foursquare in favor of school choice. And very foursquare in favor of, the teachers' unions say we want to be treated like professionals. Well, they also want to negotiate like auto workers. Seniority shouldn't be the gauge of how much you're paid. Ability should be the gauge of how much you're paid. And if you're not cutting it, you should be fired. It should work like the military. It should be the exact opposite of the way it works now. Now, you get tenure. In the military, General Petraeus was just backstage. He's in town for a week, and he was one of my mentors. And so it was great to see him. But in the military, the rule is 4 years up or out. We all know teaching is really, really hard. And we all know that teachers burn out. And union work rules prevent them from paying the price for burnout and moving on to the next phase of their lives. Now, having said that, I should add that all of this is peripheral to the most important educational metric. And this comes to another thing that Democrats won't talk about. In 1968, there was the Coleman Report, a massive report on American education. And they found that the single most important factor was parental involvement. And the parents who were involved, no matter what their income level, wound up raising more successful kids and more interested and intellectually aware kids than the parents who weren't involved. And that goes to another thing that Democrats won't talk about. My other great mentor was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and in 1965 he wrote a report about the black family and the shocking amount of out-of-wedlock births that were going on. Shocking. It was 25% at that point. Now, out-of-wedlock births among white people are 30%, and among blacks is 70%.
To be clear, though, the practical choice here, Harris on one hand, Trump on the other hand, the challenge being a new Democratic candidate, how do they move the electorate? I take from what you're saying that speaking to the center of the country, speaking perhaps to some of those swing voters in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, taking a far more centrist tack than Democrats have done in recent. You think that's the key? And I think you wrote a post about that.
Well,
right?
I've written a gazillion about that, but yes, in part. In part, there are other great strengths that a Democratic candidate can bring to the table. I've been kind of shocked that Joe Biden, who is someone I've known for a long time and admired for a long time, has had nothing to say about opioid addiction. I mean, that is a huge issue in places like Kentucky and West Virginia and Tennessee. He has had nothing to say about it. And in fact, the Republicans kind of have owned that issue a little bit by talking about the fentanyl that's coming across the southern border. And so that's an issue that can be exploited. Obviously, abortion is an issue that can be exploited. Obviously, being more rational, dare I say, sane overseas in supporting our allies, and maybe coming down a little bit harder on Bibi Netanyahu is something that can be exploited. And certainly, the price gouging by big corporations can be exploited. So those are issues that are to the left and not to the center. But, you know, consistency is not the hobgoblin of small Kleins.
Are you concerned about the role that Gaza is playing in this election?
Well, look, you and I talked about this before. I spent over 30 years going to the Middle East, going to Israel, going to the Palestinian territories. I have friends on both sides. I believe in a two-state solution. I've known Bibi Netanyahu for over 40 years, and I got to give him credit. He's always had the time of day to sit down, talk with me, no matter what I've written about him, and almost every word has been negative. He overstepped. You read David Petraeus's last book called Conflict, and doing urban warfare requires a force differential of 50 to 1. It's the toughest kind of warfare to do. It was, yes, a response. The thing that the Israelis do best are the things that they've done in the last week. They do really great targeted assassinations. Did anybody see the movie Munich? Where after the slaughter of the Israeli athletes in Munich, the Israeli intelligence services, over a period of years, went and killed everybody who was responsible for that. And that's the way they operate best. And at this point, they have this tremendous opportunity for a regional alliance against Iran that one person is standing in the way of, and that person is Bibi Netanyahu. There needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza. And I know that Biden was hoping that he would have one in place before the Democratic convention, and maybe even 3 or 4 months ago. But I think that that's one place where Kamala Harris can step out. And all she has to do is say what Biden's been saying, and it'll seem like stepping out.
To talk a little about the Republicans here, we have a situation where the Republican nominee has been convicted of a crime, a felony in New York. We also know that he was facing 3 other prosecutions, 2 of them federal prosecutions, that now are very likely, almost certainly going to be delayed until after the election. Was there a problem with the way that Attorney General Merrick Garland and perhaps some of the local prosecutors have pursued these cases? Were the cases sort of doomed from the start? Have they served to strengthen Trump in that many of his supporters believe he's been unfairly targeted? How do you feel all of that is going to play?
Yeah. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in February about the DNA of the Republican and the Democratic parties. And I went back to this wonderful Netflix movie, no, it was an HBO movie called Recount, about the Florida recount in 2000. And there was this one jump cut. Warren Christopher was running the Al Gore campaign, and he said, we have to stay as far as possible within the law. The rest of the world is watching how we handle this. It's the ultimate legal challenge. Jump cut to Jim Baker, who was running the George W. Bush campaign, and he says, we're in a street fight for the presidency of the United States. That is the DNA difference between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats litigate, Republicans fight. Now, I believe in the rule of law. I also believe every once in a while you got to punch a bully in the nose. And I think Hillary Clinton learned that in the 2016 debate when Trump was stalking her, and she later wrote, I wish I'd turned around and saying, what are you doing, you creep? If she had, things might have turned out differently. He might have melted down into a pile of brown sugar, as he appears to be doing in the last week or so. But I think that there was one real major case against Donald Trump. He tried to overthrow the government of the United States using fake electors. Jack Smith was very careful in the way he brought that case. He didn't bring up what happened on January 6th at all. It was all about the fake electors. And if Merrick Garland had moved earlier and Democrats had concentrated on that, to a certain extent, the documents case, is a legitimate case, but it isn't trying to overthrow the government of the United States, which is what Trump did. And you can't let him off the hook for that. And you had to laser in on that. And they've allowed these other things, hush money, payments to porn stars and all the rest. If he weren't Donald Trump, he would have never been indicted on that. So I think that there's a certain justification for it. I think that it has empowered him enormously among his supporters who act like a cult.
Now, here in Berkshire County, I've seen a fair number of RFK signs. Maybe a little fewer recently, and maybe after the bear incident, which I'm sure you've heard about, where he dropped a dead bear in Central Park, believe it or not. That may change some of the equation here. But until recently, he was rising in the polls at 8 or 10 points. He's been coming down a little since then. Do you think he'll be a major factor in this campaign?
You don't have to be a major factor to be a deciding factor. All you need to do is pull 1 point in Wisconsin off of Harris, 1 point in Pennsylvania, 1 point in Michigan. It's what happened in 2016. It's when the Russians, by the way, there wasn't collusion because there didn't have to be. The Russians were supporting him from the very beginning, and they were doing it in a very targeted way, targeting black radio stations in 4 cities, Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, and saying that Hillary Clinton didn't really like black people, they vote for Jill Stein. And that decided that election. Cornel West, who can only be considered a self-involved clown, may have the wherewithal to pull that 1%. So you don't have to be dealing with big numbers here. You know, usually everybody knows what happens with third-party candidates who are not Ross Perot. They fade in the end. You remember John Anderson in 1980, some of you. I see there's a lot of white hair in the audience. I mean, you remember that. But they fade. In this case, it's going to be such a closely fought election that every last percentage point is going to count.
What about, I mean, some of Kennedy's backers, one of Kennedy's prime backers, $10 billion worth, is actually a Trump supporter. And there have been a lot of reports of how the Trump campaign and Trump himself have been reaching out to Kennedy to plan a sort of October surprise in which Kennedy endorses Trump. Do you think that's likely to happen? And if it does happen, could that have a decisive effect on the election?
Well, a lot of the juice that Kennedy had was a consequence of people thinking Joe Biden was too old. Since that has gone, the polls that I've seen in the last week or two, he's taken more from Trump than he is from the Democrats. A couple of points. And, you know, given the moral character of both these men, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of an attempt at an October deal. I kind of wonder if Trump is kicking himself for not picking Kennedy as his vice president rather than single cat ladies guy.
Well, since we're here in Massachusetts, and you've obviously followed the Kennedys for much of your career, what does this RFK Jr. candidacy say about the state of the Kennedys as a political brand?
I've known that family as you have for a long time. Bobby Kennedy was my idol in the 60s. Teddy and I had some rough years, and then we had some better years when he decided he wanted to be a senator. I know those kids. They are some of the finest people I know. Not just the ones named Kennedy, but also the ones named Shriver. They are horrified by what Bobby Jr. is doing. And so I wouldn't think that this would have much of an impact on Joe Kennedy if he ever wants to come back into politics. That's young Joe. I knew old Joe back in the day.
There are a couple of old Joes. You mean the Joe, the congressman, or old Joe, really old Joe?
No, I didn't know old Joe. But I knew Joe the congressman, the older congressman. And, you know, I would hope that there'd be a place for Kathleen Kennedy Townsend in the next Democratic administration. And I know that Kerry Kennedy is a really solid person. And there are others, and Bobby and Mark Shriver. You know, I don't think that the fact that you have a black sheep brother should make it impossible for you to proceed with your life. Remember Billy Carter, who made a deal with Muammar Gaddafi? You remember Roger Clinton? I mean, and more recently, Hunter Biden, and the rest of the buck-breaking Bidens. I never held them against Joe, who I think has been a very fine public servant.
I can ask one last question. You said, and I probably stepped on it when you said early on, that this country's at a crossroads in this election. Just tell us what that crossroads is.
Well, I know a lot of people think that democracy is at stake. I'm not one of them. I think that there are a busload of ambitious young Republicans who want to run for the presidency in 2028. I think that when Donald Trump says, you're not going to have to vote anymore, he means you're not going to have to vote for me anymore. And if you're not voting for me, why would you ever want to vote for anyone? But I do think that something fundamental is at stake, and something that we have to recover, and that is a fundamental sense of American decency. And we in the media have been central to this. We have enabled it. Ever since John McLaughlin used to say, wrong, or people on Crossfire would yell at each other, rather than talk to each other. We, as I said earlier, bread and circuses sell, and we sold it. And we sold Trump, and I will tell you that there was someone on CNN, one of the presenters, who told me this story. And I may get into trouble for telling it, but I'm not going to tell you who it was. He said that he had been very critical of Trump on the air in 2016. And Trump called Jeff Zucker, who was the entertainment president of what should have been a news network. And Trump said, if you don't have this presenter come to my office and apologize to me, I am never going to appear on your network again. And Zucker called this presenter, who had to then go to Trump's office and apologize to him. So it wasn't just Fox. Trump was great ratings for everybody. He was a gold mine for all of us. And we made a lot of money off that boy. But if we want to have a country, we're going to have, to bring it around to full circle, we're going to have responsible journalism that establishes a town square, a public square where issues can be discussed and debated, and you can't have democracy without citizenship, which is why I've come to, over time, really love the US military. Because those, and right now I will say, one of the few public positions I hold is I'm on the board of a bipartisan political action committee called With Honor, and we give money to Democrats and Republicans who are post-9/11 veterans who are running for the House, but only if they sign a pledge to caucus together, to meet with each other at least once a month, to share things. And I've spent a lot of time with those kids, and they are the greatest source of optimism that I have for this country. By the way, we endorsed our first governor last time, Governor Wes Moore of Maryland. I've known Wes for a long time too, and watch out for Wes.
We got a few questions here, some good ones. Joe, how can you say that women's rights have increased after Roe versus Wade was overturned? It seems like we're going backwards as opposed to forward.
Well, look, abortion isn't the only woman's right. It's an important one, and I really do have some mixed feelings about it. I mean, I've always thought that issues like abortion should be decided legislatively rather than in the courts. I think that when it's decided legislatively by referendum, as it was in a place like Kansas, it's going to be approved overwhelmingly. But I also think the Democrats have to answer some very hard questions. And one question I would ask Kamala Harris, and probably be booed for it, would be, does a woman who finds out, who has a viable fetus, 24, 25, 26 weeks old, and finds out that that fetus has Down syndrome, should she have the right to end that life? Someone just said yes. Well, that's one point of view, but it's a damn tough question. And Democrats have been too cavalier on this issue. And Republicans have been too ridiculous on this issue. Sanity lies somewhere in the middle, I think.
Okay. What are your thoughts that should Harris appear to get more votes, that Trump will either challenge it to the Supreme Court or try in some other way to overturn the result?
Well, he never admits to losing anything, and he won't admit to losing this. But he doesn't control the government at this point. And even when he controlled the government, he wasn't able to stop that election from being decided correctly. So, I mean, it's a worry for sure. And violence is a worry for sure. I suspect it's going to be close, and I suspect it's going to be challenged.
Do you think it would be challenged on both sides?
Probably not on the Democratic side. The Democrats actually believe in arithmetic.
Someone asked, will you be in touch with Vice President Harris?
If she calls. I mean, some do, some don't. One of the reasons why I really loved Barack Obama was that he would call me up and yell at me. We actually had a screaming fight at one point in the West Wing. He was just outside the Oval Office. And I took that as a tremendous compliment because it meant that he trusted me. He knew I wouldn't go public with it. And I spent now 40 years trying to, and I had screaming fights with Hillary Clinton. And I spent 40 years trying to get Bill Clinton into a fight, and I could never do it. So, which meant he didn't trust me. Probably he shouldn't have.
So, which Republican, potential Republican endorsement of Harris do you think would be the most problematic for Trump? Be it Bush, Cheney, can't read the others. What's that? Romney. Oh, Romney. Yeah, Romney's there, and there's a fourth one I can't read. So your penmanship counts. What do you think? What would be the one that would have the most impact on Trump?
Well, I'm waiting for some Republicans who have endorsed Trump to change their minds. If this guy's going to run this despicable campaign, race-based campaign, at some point, some Republican, I'd love to see Nikki Haley turn around and say, I just can't do this. And the other thing I'd like to see is, I haven't talked much about my experience with the military, other than to mention that David Petraeus was one of my mentors. But I knew all of those by the way, I didn't know a single general who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, including several of them who served in his administration. And I'd love to see those guys, John Kelly, Jim Mattis, H.R. McMaster, Milley, do an ad where they say, we're military, we don't take sides in elections. But this guy called us a bunch of suckers, and we can't vote for him.
I thought, following up in that area, last question. Do you believe that an all-out war with Iran and Israel is inevitable?
Well, I've been to Iran a couple of times. It's an issue that I follow closely, and as I said, the thing I miss most about being an actual reporter is going over to that part of the world. And here's the thing that you have to understand about Iran. This generation, well, the first thing you have to understand is that it's really a military dictatorship run by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. The mullahs are a fig leaf, and they only represent about 30% of the Shiite leadership in Iran. I was once there in the midst of a riot where quietist mullahs were having their heads cracked open by the Basij, the religious police. Boy, did I run fast that day. But the thing you have to understand about Iran is that this generation of leaders grew up in the 1980s as college students, some of them younger, some of them a little bit older. They grew up at a time when they were bombarded by Iraq. Tehran was bombarded by Iraq. There were poison gas attacks. You walk the streets of Tehran and you see people shaking uncontrollably with signs around their necks saying, "Chemical victim of the war." Every Iranian I know, including those who are hardliners, are terrified that that would happen again. The last conversation I had with Bibi Netanyahu, he said to me, "Joe, I have it on the very best authority that as soon as the mullahs get the bomb, they're going to launch on us." And I started to laugh. And he said, "What's so funny?" And he said, "You don't think that they know that if they ever launched on Israel, they would be incinerated 15 minutes later?" So the next day I had lunch with the deputy director of the Mossad, Ilan Mizrahi, who I can name now because he's since retired. And I said, "I saw Bibi last night, and this is what he told me." And I told him the story, and he started to laugh. And I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "Oh, that's what he tells all the Americans, especially the evangelicals who come around. He takes them up in a helicopter, shows them that it's only 12 miles wide, scares the hell out of them. And Bibi's a very persuasive guy, but his tragic flaw is that he thinks he has 20 IQ points on everybody. Sooner or later, that's going to catch up with him."
All right.
So let me just say in closing, thank you for being here. I know that if I've been successful, I've probably offended each of you in some way or another. but you know, that's my job, and it's always been based on what I've seen and done, and it's been a tremendous privilege. It sure beat working, and Fred, thank you for what you do, because it's absolutely essential. And Peter, thank you for what you do too.
Thank you. Well, I'm supposed to wrap this up, but I think Joe did a much better job than I could. I think I want to hear from both these men. I mean, a scintillating, interesting evening. We're all going to go home wiser, perhaps a little sadder, but wiser. I heartily recommend that you, if you're not already a subscriber to the Sanity Clause, do it, because this man makes you think, and that's what we need. For those of you that are going to that have tickets to the reception afterwards, step to the my right, your left, and we'll be there. And finally, a commercial. You will be getting something in the mail from the Berkshire Eagle later this week about the local journalism fund. For all of you've helped already. If you can help some more, that will help us do more. But thank you very much for all you've done, and thank these people. Anytime I speak to a crowd, I always say the same thing at the end. If you see something in the paper you like, please tell all of your friends. And if you see something you don't like, tell me. Thank you, good night, and have a safe trip home.